So I think it's time to start, isn't it? We've hit 3 o'clock. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the British Academy Virtual Summer Showcase for the event Culture in Crisis. And you need an upward inflection there because that has a question mark at the end of it. And that, I think, speaks to the volatility, the strange volatility of the moment that we find ourselves in now. This week, the government U-turned on the provision of free school meals and wound up the Department for International Development. So we're clearly at one of those moments where politically all the bets are off. My name's Matthew Sweet and I'm your host for this event. And it's my job to bring those of you zooming in now into contact with what I'm thinking of as a kind of SAGE committee for culture. It's happening under the umbrella of the British Academy, which supports research in the humanities and social sciences nationally and internationally. And it's an organisation that likes debate. So you'll get your chance to have your say if you submit a question via the Q&A button on your screen. Today's event stems from the themes explored in the Academy's new policy programme, Shape the Future, which argues that its community of fellows and researchers have a role to play and insights to offer as we emerge from lockdown into, well, whatever lies on the other side of it. So here's the story so far. At the height of lockdown, institutions and individual talents mobilised their own form of cultural emergency service. But what happens next? While other European countries have put arts funding at the heart of their recovery programs that are happening now, nothing like this has quite yet been announced here. So should we be steeling ourselves for the loss of the Globe Theatre or the South Bank Centre? Or should we be learning from this experience and asking, is this an opportunity to reinvent in some way our relationship with culture and the arts, to start doing it in new ways that are less reliant on traditional institutions? Well, it's time now to meet the sages here, all professors, all fellows of the British Academy. Each one will give us 5 minutes of their thoughts, during which we can also check out their bookshelves and their lockdown grooming decisions as well. I'll then chat to them and then it'll be your turn. So remember that Q&A button on your screen. So first, it's John Sloboda, Distinguished Scholar of Music and the Mind. John.
Thank you very much. Well, we have many questions to face and as yet few answers, and my presentation will raise some of the questions, maybe not so many of the answers. But we do know that live performing art is special. The interplay between performers and audience in the same physical space has vital characteristics that cannot be reproduced online or in recordings. Live performances allow subtle and continuous signals of gesture, of look, of timing, of sound to flow from performer to performer and back and forwards to the audience, so that the feel of the room can lift performers to new heights, and likewise the fizz of performer-performer interaction can ignite audience response. The restrictions of COVID-19 have driven a huge wedge through these vital elements for audiences, performers, and venues. To take them briefly in turn, audiences. Well, audiences feed off the sociability of the live event in so many ways. It's not just about what is on stage and how you might react to that. It's an opportunity for making or renewing friendships, or of submerging your individuality in a crowd to which you feel you belong. It's also about what you can do before or after the show and who you can do it with, maybe in a nearby restaurant or pub. How can live events fulfill these requirements when 3/4 of the seats may be empty and it may be hard to find anywhere open nearby? So what is physically and medically allowable may actually not be emotionally satisfying to audiences. Turning to performers, most performing arts require the close physical contact of performers to one another. Orchestras are tightly packed together on a stage or in a pit, ensembles of actors and singers depict the full range of close human encounters. One-person shows and small chamber music groups might survive under social distancing, but this is a very lean diet indeed. How can we open to the full range of performing options? And what about rehearsals? How do performers do all the development and workshopping that comes before any public performance? Artists may need to develop entire new modes of collaborative work that allows the highest artistic standards while respecting distancing rules. This cannot be done overnight, and it cannot be done without intensive reflection, research, trial and error. So a question, of course, which I'm thinking about a lot is how best do our music conservatoires and drama schools innovate to equip our current students for this new uncertain future? And what would be really useful is some detailed scientific research on the infection risks associated with such things as singing together, playing musical instruments together. There have been a few isolated pilot studies, none so far in the UK, as far as I know. The performing arts world needs really solid evidence from comprehensive peer-refereed studies to get the answers they need. What about venues? Well, there is an increasing chorus of alarm coming from theatres, concert halls and art centres. It's very hard to see how large venues with all their overheads will be sustainable with small audiences. How will free movement in spaces such as foyers and bars be managed? Some financial modelling is being undertaken, but the early results are not encouraging. The short-term sticking plaster in terms of government aid will not solve the deeper underlying problems with these venues. And in all of this, we need to ask, are we trying to head for as near back to normal, if we can, or is there actually an opportunity for rethinking some fundamental relationships? Conversations are developing around issues of diversity and inclusion. Can we use this crisis as an opportunity to redraw the map of who gets access to performing arts and their resources? For instance, can independent artists cut out the middleman of the big institutions and reach out directly to potential audiences? Local grassroots networks are seen as more inclusive, requiring less expensive upfront investment. And finally, we must not forget the whole vibrant area of participatory arts, which bring professionals and non-professionals together. For instance, some 2 million people in the UK belong to choirs, often self-funded, but they are all now furloughed. The social and psychological benefits of communal singing are multiple and profound. Our communities need choirs, and this is another reason why rigorous research on safe singing is urgently needed to get Britain singing again. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, John. Next, I'm going to introduce Marina Warner, novelist, scholar, explorer of the cultural unconscious of the world. Marina.
Thank you. After we'd been in lockdown for about a month, a friend asked me, what do you miss most? I hadn't really thought about it. I realized I was suppressing memories of the old way of life in order not to feel this aching hole inside and despair. Before COVID, culture was under stress and struggling, but nevertheless we thought it was built to last and widely valued. But now, how do we stop the wreckage? Complex powers of expression are the distinctive capacity of human beings. Our uniqueness as a species lies in our ability to think beyond our experience, to imagine things we do not know, but can arrive at knowing by making mental representations. We do this in relation to other people. Even the most exceptionally gifted individual needs reciprocity and exchanges. That's what we mean by culture. We grow together over time. It is in totalitarian regimes that silence is enforced and expressiveness muzzled. In this country, we have an extraordinary historical legacy, and we have a responsibility of care to that legacy, the English language, and all that has followed from its troubling history and global spread. The remarkable voices in fiction and every other genre of literature, the excellence of our performing arts, the astonishing riches of our museums, the worldwide appeal of our colleges of higher education, and I could go on. Throughout the lockdown, there have been wonderful improvised acts of redress, ingenious and very moving, like the montages of musicians and dancers in their kitchens and backyards, wicked jokes on WhatsApp.
Oh, I think we might have lost Marina there briefly. I'm going to suggest that we move on to, while we reconnect with Marina, that we jump on to the poet and literary scholar Isabel Armstrong, and then we can bring Marina back in. Isabel, floor's yours.
Right, thank you. I'll begin with E. Cummings's wonderful statement. Well, write poetry for God's sake. It's the only thing that matters. Are poets in this COVID crisis taking him at his word? On the face of it, it seems so. Poetry is fortunate because it can go online in a way that music and drama, who have been horribly affected by the COVID crisis, cannot. So on the face of it, things are good. Only last night, you could be online with Inua Ilam's rap party, or you could have looked at Poetry London's readings on YouTube. If you look around, there are innumerable activities and initiatives going on. There's Carol Ann Duffy's Write Where We Are Now with the Manchester Writing School, featuring, among other poets, Imtiaz Darker, Roger McGough, Zafar Kunal, Grace Nichols. There's the Inside Writing project from Newcastle's Centre for the Literary Arts, teamed up with the Institute of English Studies to create a dialogue between the writing of poetry and the thinking about it. There's Afrolit Sans Frontier, there's Black Poets Speak Out, there's Royal Holloway's Poetics Research Centre writ through this poetry readings, most recently featuring Drew Milne and Ariana Benson. There's also Caroline Bergvall's incredible, astonishing Sonoscura, a multimedia online project, which is a collage of voices, languages, images, sounds, and actually incorporates into this the audience's live, real-time responses to the performance. So there's a great deal going on, and this is heroic, but it's in the setting of what has been described as a 74 billion cultural catastrophe for the creative industries. And this is in the context of a truly massive national deficit, which has been hiding in plain sight for some time. And that's the removal of poetry and the arts to the periphery of the educational curriculum, so that children and young people in their formative moments of their lives are denied the nourishment that the poetry and the arts can provide centrally to imaginative and intellectual experience. So why has the pandemic taught us that this nourishment is so important? I think it's for this reason. Poetry is a vitally interactive form. It's a paradigm for all the arts. A poem is a collaborative experience, and the arousal of the perceiver's or listener's creativity is as important as the poet's. It's where our own language is made, remade, reimagined, and above all, shared. Words are at the center, and in this dialogic experience, we are all equals before the poem's imagination. That's why the experience is a civic, a democratic experience. Dylan Thomas said, "Your bliss and suffering is forever shared and forever all your own." I was vividly reminded of this, and this is my last point, at the meeting of a poetry writing group where the topic was a word cascade that we were creating around the idea of roses. One of the members of the group started off and produced, to our amazement, the word barbaric. Why were roses barbaric? Well, he said, roses have thorns, roses are like barbed wire, and so barbaric was a kind of pun. But in addition to this, he'd been reading about the death camps, and he had noted that roses grew round the entrance gates to Auschwitz. So in this remarkable moment, something new was made, collectively made, by the group, by the single word, barbaric. I think a poet is anybody who wouldn't call himself a poet, said Bob Dylan. He meant that poetry is intrinsically part of the everyday.
Thank you, Isabel. Marina, you've unfrozen and reconnected with us. So
Yeah,
we
really
left you, I
sorry.
think you left us at a moment of despair. I'm hoping, but I suspect that you might be about to shift a gear. So
Yeah,
you're back with
thank
us.
you so much. Yes, I was just saying that people had been very clever improvising because the need for expression is so strong in people, even when they're crushed and isolated. And if the whole of culture isn't to shrink, if access to its riches and to education is not to become evermore the exclusive pleasure of the fee-paying, action and funds are needed. Now, I know every sector needs money, and we all recognize that every sector has a strong claim. But funding for culture is investment in the whole public good, in connectedness and mutual thriving for everyone, but most especially the young, the society of the present and the future. The country needs a new culture deal, collaborating across the arts and education. Just a little slice of HS2 costs would do it. Each mile of track is costing £307 million, or so the papers reported in February. So the cost of a mere 5, 10, 20 miles of track, that would be a start. We also need to work on reaping revenues from the existing structures of the digital era, a new form of copyright, so that when I look up a quotation, research a book online, listen to a concert, read a poem, my search gets logged and adds to the sum to be shared out to all who made the works in the first place. The BBC needs to come into this fully, to stage a summer school, a kind of open festival of the arts, and not just to meet immediate COVID needs of young people, but for the long term. Storytelling, history walks, creative sessions in various media could pop up in the empty retail premises of the high streets. And I'd like a multimedia project rolled out across the whole country, something like the Wartime Recording Britain project of Kenneth Clark, sending out creatives to capture the spirit of place, the day-to-day lives of people at work and play, to assemble a huge memory map of the country so that knowledge of where we came from deepens and helps us to discover where we could be going. And so some of the causes of rage that are now blighting our streets are met and explored. So lockdown has given us a glimpse into what we miss and into what we value: contact, exchange, expression. Culture in all its variety has been made as a result of long collective activity and thought. Let's hope someone is listening. Let's not our culture become history.
Thanks very much indeed, Marina Warner. And just a reminder to those of you in on this seminar event with us, if you use your Q&A button on the screen, then you can get some questions in there that I can then put to our guests this afternoon. It's time to hear our last presentation, which is from the film historian, Ian Christie. Ian, ready for your close-up?
Thank you, Matthew. I think everyone is probably very well aware by now that the crisis that's affected live arts and their practitioners is deep and urgent. But what about screen arts? What we currently watch at home on screens of all sizes? There's certainly evidence that some people are binge watching material that's already available online, box sets of drama and documentary series. And they're probably delving into some of those vast online libraries of older television and films. And there are also channels that are specializing in older films, which offer an extraordinary chance to discover what we didn't know about cinema history. And of course, there are our own collections of DVDs. So what's the problem? Is screen culture in anything like the same kind of crisis as the other arts? Or is it providing a kind of national sanity service by giving us easy access to a huge amount of material available for us to discover and enjoy? I think discover is the key word here. And it's something that analysts have been talking about for some years in the digital era: how to make new and specialized material discoverable within the vast array of digital offerings. Or indeed, how to make us aware of what's already there, but we've never heard about. What the current freeze on film festivals and new releases and awards ceremonies, some of which are trying to keep on going in virtual form, shows us is that these rituals play an important part in setting our agenda for what we decide to watch, even if this is online and long after the event. So the question facing us now is, how are our agendas being shaped? Are we being encouraged to go out and seek fresh film and television experiences, or indeed to refresh our understanding of cinema history in any meaningful way? But there's another large question looming over the whole culture of cinema, and that's how important is the live experience of viewing as part of an audience? It's very similar to the anxiety being faced in theatre and opera and live music, of course. It's true that as a matter of simple statistics, most of our film viewing now is personal. I mentioned this in an online talk for the British Academy recently. But many people, makers as well as spectators, still feel that there's a special quality to being part of a social audience, whether it's at a festival, at a retrospective, or just in your local cinema. And if this whole experience is denied, as it is at present, does that make 120 years of cinema just museum culture? There's been some psychological research done on this, and perhaps there needs to be more done, especially as we've recently seen a resurgence of communal viewing on very large screens, on IMAX screens, on great open-air screens. And as well, don't forget, we've seen the beginnings of a new culture of virtual reality experiences to explore, which might seem to be something you can do at home, but actually it opens new possibilities for screen arts and indeed for other arts. Surely, there's got to be more than spectatorship than just sitting in our living rooms in front of a medium-sized screen. My final worry in this current crisis obviously has to be for the makers of films and television, most of whom can't currently work in production as they usually did. And especially for the young and the unknown artists in these fields who have still to find their audiences and make their reputations. Which takes me back to discovery. We are facing a crisis of discoverability amid all our digital resources, which will affect future generations in ways that we can't possibly predict or imagine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, everybody. And what strikes me as I listen to you all talking, in a way, is how we're all going through this process of trying to anticipate how we are going to navigate this world that we will find ourselves in when, in a way, we kind of finally open the shelter door. And what I'd like to know, and perhaps I could put this to you, Marina, is it our kind of individual or collective intention to fight for every gallery, every venue, every theatre group, every institution, or do you find yourself accepting that the landscape is going to change in some very significant way?
But I think that if we don't decide to really create a policy with the arts and the humanities and the broader sense of that at its centre, we will simply drift into the market economy even more deeply than we have already. And that this will be utterly disastrous. Because while you actually might say, well, we can't support every single museum, the ones that will go will be in the places where they are, in a sense, most needed, where there are fewer accessible areas of exploration, discovery, the word Ian used, singing together. We need to keep a collective sense of how this is a value that needs to be for everyone. Otherwise, we will just end up in the position of Glyndebourne, which of course tries to create very well things on, screenings online and education, but is basically a privileged piece of culture, I'm afraid. And we can't let that happen to everything. We can't let that happen to poetry. We can't let that happen to thinking, to museums. I mean, there's obviously going to be a problem about charging. We've got to think out the policy on that. Are we going to start charging? Will that help? No, it won't help, because we want to keep young people flowing through these places.
That sounds, in essence, like a yes. Then, Marina, what about you, John? Is it a case of formulating a kind of defence policy for the institutions that we love and that we work within?
I think it's about reshaping what we have. I don't think we can go back to what was there before. but we can retrieve things, I think. And I think we've got to make use of things like empty premises in high streets for community centres, arts and community centres. And I think they've got to be run actually on the cheap. I think they've got to be made by the community. We must have that, I think, as an element in the new setup. And how to make some of these things, operas, theatre even, less elitist. It's always been a problem.
Sorry, John, there are empty spaces, unoccupied spaces in the post-COVID world, the bomb sites, I suppose, of this world, that culture might take root in if we can nurture it in the right way.
Absolutely, and I think that the push towards localism is probably a way we should go, without completely deprivileging our big national institutions. We need far more, as it were, self-sustaining culture, which is responsive to local need in different towns, cities, counties. So I think we'll see a distribution, a redistribution of perhaps resources and centres of activity and creativity, rather than it all being led from the centre. What
do you think about that in terms of cinema, Ian? Because that is sort of happening already, isn't it? There's a lot of venues like that. There's an excellent one near me in a half-empty shopping centre in Catford, where a cinema kind of sprang up like a mushroom. Cinema seems quite suited to this sort of guerrilla activity.
Well, this is one of the ironies of digital. Digital has made possible cinema wherever you want it to be, which is fantastic. And so pop-up cinemas, local cinemas, temporary cinemas, whatever you want to call them, have become a real possibility. And of course, they will return. The very first kinds of cinema viewing that will happen, for sure, is going to be, they don't have to be drive-ins, they can be walk-ins in a field or in an empty site anywhere near you. That's good, and that will happen. I'm very confident of that. But I think I'm also worried about the infrastructure, the underpinning. And my thoughts go back, since we're talking about future planning, my thoughts go back to obviously the post-war period, and to not only the fact that the Arts Council was created really in the immediate aftermath of World War II, with a fantastic mission to actually spread the arts actively at the highest level and at the most local level. And, often forgotten, just a few years later, the National Film Finance Corporation was created in the midst of a meltdown of British cinema. In 1948, one Harold Wilson at the Board of Trade had this vision that if we didn't do something, there wouldn't be any cinema making left in Britain. And he created the NFFC, which for many, many years supported emerging talent, indigenous filmmaking, until it was wound up by one Margaret Thatcher.
Marina, you also alluded to that post-war moment. You also mentioned the New Deal, but you might equally have said Marshall Plan, I think, as New Deal. Yeah. And it strikes me that Facebook and Google are culture too, aren't they? If we're thinking about who might fund a Marshall Plan.
Well, that's why I think that we need. I mean, the European Writers' Union has actually called for a copyright levy of some kind to be devised. I have no idea, I'm not a software person, but I would have thought it would be possible to do that. It could be tiny increments, one would not even notice it hardly, but it would accumulate. But this film industry is a very good example, I think, of how the need for nurturing culture more widely than the object itself, because while it's a great pleasure and a great importance that we are able to watch so many wonderful films, new and old, we need to have the people coming along, the writers, the imaginative adapters, the mask makers, all the whole incredible panoply of gifts and talents required to make a film. That needs to be leavened and it can be grown as a state industry as it should be. And I think there've been sort of now and then. But I think it's a model for how one could do other things. And I agree, the Marshall Plan and the New Deal. I mean, the Works Progress Administration, you know, it's hard, I can hardly see Boris announcing this, but, but that was, again, brought about some remarkable masterpieces where people were indigent, penniless artists were sent out, writers, to create new marvelous buildings and projects for the whole of the United States.
Isabel, what do you make of that idea? Is the post-war moment a good one to be thinking about as we navigate out of this?
I think it is, but there is a tension between, and I think there always will be, between proactive state subsidy for the arts and independent local developments. I mean, in a way, the state has to create some kind of framework to let individual talent burgeon. It can't be a sort of controlling entity. I think that's the problem, and I think that it's got to kind of have confidence in localities and clusters of people to take things forward and be creative. That's my sense. I think the post-war moment, which I lived through, was really quite amazing. I don't think we can ever quite go back to that, but we can find some kind of equivalent for it.
John, what are your thoughts about that? Because obviously, you know, there is. I would like to maybe draw on your understanding of on the psychological level about people's need for culture and for music, and does that post-war moment also provide a bit of data or guidance in that regard?
I wonder whether the situation is rather different now, because people are so used to participatory art. I mean, participatory art is really a very big part of how people now engage in art and culture. I mean, not only choirs, I'm thinking of immersive theatre, and people really need that sense of being at something special and unique. If you weren't there, you missed it. And my feeling is, if you ask people what's their most memorable cultural experience, they're very unlikely to talk about a recording or even an online experience, but an experience when they are totally immersed as human beings with other human beings in the here and now. And so we do need to find ways, I think, of allowing those kinds of experiences more sway in what goes forward.
I agree. I think the online experience is really quite thin when you. I mean, there's been a lot of rearguard action through online presentations, but ultimately it's never going to be as satisfactory as the immediate interaction between people.
Well, let's address that, because that strange body, the audience, is one that you all referred to, and it's hard to imagine that we're going to kind of return to those kind of densely populated spaces anytime soon, apart from perhaps Andrew Lloyd Webber's reopened and thoroughly disinfected Palladium, as he's been speaking about today, drawing on the Korean model of return to normality. Do we have to accept that the audience is going to be, you know, a different kind of creature for possibly years to come? John?
Well, when one thinks back to what live performance was, and particularly live music, which is what I know most about, it was domestic music. It was groups of people in their own homes doing music together. And maybe we have a route, because there are such things as bubbles, and those bubbles might become a bit bigger, where you could have a group of families in a locality who perhaps rent the local village hall and hire a musician or a drama group to entertain them. Basically, a slightly enlarged domesticity. Maybe this might be one of the ways forward.
I don't think it's exclusion. It's, you know, the one excludes the other. If one thinks about John's model, and then thinks about the sort of global reach of networked collaborations, because one of the things that's been happening is global writing sessions, in which someone in Trinidad will be talking to somebody in India, talking to someone in London, and creating a poem or a story together. That's actually been happening in lockdown. And at the moment, the limitations on that are more to do with the technology. They're not so much to do with the fact that the person isn't present. And, you know, when Ian was talking about virtual reality, you know, that if the technology is enhanced, we can probably get past the deadening flatness of the current Zoom technology. And I think there's a great potential there, because these things are in stages. You could have a global, distanced, separate type of collaboration, creation, as you get in teaching. We shouldn't forget that a lot of teaching is now being done online. And you get these exchanges, they do happen. And then later, we hope there will be a normality, and later we can start doing these things more together in more local places.
There
It
is
doesn't to exclude each other.
No, I very much feel that they don't, and I think I want to put in a word for the mediated experience as well as the live experience, because I think it's become very important. I mean, I know a lot of people whose main engagement with opera is by going to their local cinema. I mean, that's been a real phenomenon of the last decade, and it's real. I would say myself, just from my own experience, that actually a performance of Parsifal that I attended in my local cinema was better, definitely better than most Parsifals I've seen in various opera houses. So no, I think the online, the digital, the mediated, let's call it, is here to stay. It isn't going to go away, and it can be very special. It can be, you know, at the peak of speaking to us in a way that we couldn't possibly achieve by going and queuing and sitting in a sweaty opera house, in the case of opera.
I want to bring in some questions from the audience who have joined us, and there's one I'd like to put to you that speaks to just what you've been saying there, Ian. It's from Matt. He says, "Hi, I'm a 17-year-old wanting to go and see as many shows and events as possible, but costs and travel accessibility limit this. This COVID world has opened up many opportunities to watch and be a part of a thing from my house at little cost. I want to know what you think about after the pandemic is over. How much culture should remain online?" Isabel.
Oh, I think a great deal. I think we'll have a sort of multiform kind of return to culture. My own feeling is that online experience is of two kinds. One is of the sort that Ian's just mentioned, but the other is collaborative. I think when online experience at its best is when there is a kind of interplay between people. And my hope is that although that these other traditional arts will find ways of having a rebirth, I hope that there'll be a sort of renaissance of collaborative making of all kinds, in poetry, in art, in all kinds of ways.
What do you think, Ian, because this seems most obviously relevant to your art form?
Well, you know, once upon a time, the culture of cinema used to be very narrow indeed, because if you didn't live near the kind of cinema that showed cultural film, you were lost. I remember starting a video company when I worked at the British Film Institute back at the end of the 80s. And some of my colleagues said to me, "You want people to watch films on video?" I said, "Yes, I want them to watch films. And this is the only way they're going to see a film like, for instance, The Seven Samurai. There was only one copy in the country. There was no other way to see it. We published it in video. We sold 20,000 units in the first year. And I've often thought that somebody like Matt, who just sent in that question, possibly living far from any cinema that would ever show Seven Samurai, could have did buy a copy on VHS and see it for the first time. So we must remember the affordances, the opportunities that have been created by modern media. We're not going to lose them, obviously. The question is, what do they lead to? Do they produce satisfying cultural experiences? And as I said, do they produce discoveries which can then lead on and, you know, produce new experiences?
But you made a point earlier, Ian, that was really valuable, which is that people need to discover things where they need perhaps a guide. I mean, you don't just come across The Last Samurai video and buy it. You somehow need to be, I mean, maybe Matt is able to do that, but on the whole, you need to be nurtured in some sort of, in a context, which is usually a teaching context or a parental context, which leads you to have this curiosity, which leads you to the discoveries. That's why I sort of plead for a joined up approach rather than not just a joining up of the cultural institutions, but also the education institutions, so that it all works together towards this ideal world that we hoped will perhaps return.
Let's get some more in from the audience here, because I fear I've been neglecting them a bit. This one has a connection with the answer where we've just gone. I think Anastasia asks, with culture being more widely available online, how will this impact London's status as the epicenter of culture, arguably? Could there be a potential for increased revenues now experiences are opened up to a bigger audience that were previously location specific? Who'd like to answer that? You're nodding at that, Marina.
Well, I've noticed these enormous audiences. I mean, I think the first production I watched streamed from the National Theatre had 3,000 people watching it. I mean, it was the rather wonderful Twelfth Night, and that's astonishing. So that's that without creating a firewall, I mean, there should be some way of fructifying that financially for the theatre without there being a firewall preventing young people from watching it.
We've talked about access too, and Charlotte Crofts asked a question about that. And she asks, could you elaborate on how post-pandemic culture might address some of the other issues of access, inclusion and diversity, which are so starkly being exposed in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement? You know, do you see any kind of suggestion of transformation or reform in that regard? Isabel, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a matter of trusting groups, actually, to develop identities and projects independently. There's an enormous range, a huge spectrum of actually online activities currently in the in the area of poetry, and I'm quite sure that these are not London-based. These can go all over the place. These can go from Newcastle, Manchester, and so on. And I think that that's really important. I think it's important to get a kind of local online culture going, as well as a kind of a municipal, cosmopolitan one.
People in the Q&A feed are actually pitching their ideas about how to do this. Here's a good one. Here's one from Julia Davis. She says she's come up with the idea of tap into talent. That will be a hashtag, which a colleague she was speaking to somebody in the DCMS, she says today. Millions of left behind children all across the country, millions of creative freelancers and practitioners who've worked in schools all across the country. Let's put the two together for 3 months in a simple but effective package and get it straight to heads and deliver locally. What
Yes.
does the panel think? This is kind of Dragon's Den now. So
very good. Yeah, I mean, yes, and there's this commissioner for cultural renewal and recovery to whom this idea should immediately go.
John, what do you think about that?
It sounds very good. And I wanted to return a little bit to the issue of money, which was raised by Marina. We do need smart ways of ensuring that there has been a little bit of, some people say, too much free stuff during COVID, giving people the expectation that if it's online, it's free. And people very well understand that if you go to a concert or a show, you pay an entry price. And I think we've got to find some acceptable way of making it seem quite okay to pay for an online experience. And I think that would be part of what's needed to make all this work well.
Yes, and in fact, contrary to people's belief, it actually costs quite a lot to put an online show to let it come into being. I was thinking of Caroline Bergwall's show in particular. That's immensely complex in terms of designers and so on. So there is an issue of finance, most certainly. But to come back to the earlier question, I do think that one of the things we've got to remember is that we have to start with children. We have to start with children in schools. We have to start at that level when we're talking about a kind of cultural renaissance or a new vision for culture.
Peter Florence, who knows a thing or two about festivals himself, says, the great advantage of a digital experience is that the audience is global and far more diversified than a sometimes quite tribal or homogenous gathering of people in a room. What other advantages do you see for digital producers in a global sphere? It's good, surely, for old people who are geographically isolated, perhaps, as well as access for the young at very low cost. who'd like to tackle that? Marina.
Well, I think there's a difference between products created for digital transmission and products not. And I think there's a great potential in products created for digital transmission. Isabel was mentioning Caroline Bergvall's poetry, that recent workshop. I'm afraid I missed that bit of it because I was off air, but I know exactly what you're talking about. This is created for the web. And that, I think, is, you know, the Hay festivals, assemblies could be filmed and beamed out to thee, but they're not created for the web. There's a tremendous difference aesthetically and also in terms of financing. But globally, yes, I think the global and the diversity and the reaching out couldn't be more important.
Well, perhaps one of the things that we want to keep from this period is this simultaneous online access. It seems, you know, it really doesn't seem impossible that these things will happen simultaneously, and we might expect any live event to be accessible domestically as well. Nathaniel Davis has sent in a question. He says, I'm a 22-year-old drama BA honours graduate, and my question is, do you think theatres will have to adapt to survive by making better use of the online world and community? But how can this be done when many regional theatres were struggling financially before without learning or creating theatre also for an online platform? It's a big ask, really, isn't it, of these theatres and other arts institutions. John?
It's really unclear to know how sustainable the kinds of theatres we have around the country are going to be in the long term. And what the questioner needs is a notion of a career path that in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, there's going to be meaningful work for graduates in drama schools. And I'm afraid I don't have any easy answers. And I was just thinking in all of this discussion, we are trying to look for the positives and the hopeful, but Marina started her presentation by saying there is a lot of grief and a lot of despair. And I think we do have to face up to the fact that possibly some things will be lost, and they might be lost in the long term, and they might be lost even permanently. And it's not clear which yet of those things we are going to lose.
And should we be saying, John, that is okay, because that will just be a consequence of crisis, and something else will come up in its place? I mean, Isabel earlier on was talking about the persistence of poetry in Auschwitz. If poetry can survive Auschwitz, then culture ought to be able to survive an experience like this.
Yes, but it does mean suspending one's expectations. And for example, if one's just come out of drama school, a lot of one's training probably will have to be retooled for the new environment.
Isabel, you were going to come in, I think.
I
then Ian. Isabel first and then Ian.
Okay.
Oh, well, I was just thinking that I think it actually is a tragedy for theatre in particular. And secondly, perhaps music, that this crisis has created a situation when we can't see a way forward. And I'm wondering if there ought to be some kind of, not exactly commission, but we should set up some kind of group to think hard about how theatre and music in its older form might be either survive or be rethought in certain ways. I mean, one of the possibilities is actually, like the Nightingale hospitals, you know, finding new venues that are actually easier to create theatre and music in. But I think we can't let it rest. I think we can't just say, fine, goodbye, these local theatres, these local orchestras and so on. That I think is criminal. And it's so awful for young people who train musicians and drama students. It's awful for our culture. I mean, it's really, really dire. And I think therefore we've got to not just let it happen, but to think about it, try and campaign for some kind of committee or group set up to really think about this, think this through.
Ian Christie.
Well, I go back to, and I didn't think I would be talking about this, but I think it's really important to say it. Britain was broke at the end of World War II. The greatest economist in the world, Maynard Keynes saw that culture was absolutely vital to build a new world out of the ruins and the ashes of the war. And he made it, for what little time remained for him, an absolute priority that culture had to get funding. Otherwise, you don't actually recover from the war. And I think we are in that kind of situation. Marina said earlier, she talked about the continued marketization of culture. I think we have to really resist that. Just plain resist it and say, no, it is not acceptable that everything has to pay its way, that little handouts can be given at the edges. Culture costs money. And I think we've all stressed that you cannot do these things on the cheap, otherwise everybody gets casualized. Culture costs money, and the state needs to put in place the necessary supports to ensure that culture continues and is renewed and develops in what is the post-COVID, the digital, but also the tangible world.
I mean, I don't terribly like financial arguments for the value of culture, because I don't think that's the main point at all, and it shouldn't be the main point in people's minds. But at the same time, every penny spent is incredibly valuable in terms of investment in the people of that community. If you take a local theatre, which like the Manchester theatre is now threatened, an excellent theatre with a great history, it's incredibly important to the town, to the well-being of the town, to the health of the young people, to the education system in the town, to the tourists who come to Manchester, to the people who visit the art gallery, that there should be a play on that night. That isn't too expensive to attend. This is money that is so much better spent than on Trident or on HS2 or on, I don't know, corporate insurance fellow schemes. I mean, it is so much more valuable to the people who live in this country.
Culture is not an optional extra. It's something profound. It's something that the community, the very diverse constituencies of our country can explore and come together with. And I think this is what Keynes has recognized post-war. It's really, really central. And questions of cost are really almost a separate matter, I think.
Isabel, you talked about committees, and we've talked talked a little about what kind of structures might administer this world. The writer Lisa Opinionese asks, the practical structures for rolling the arts out and responding to the local used to include councils who in part still control high streets, but now not much else. What would you think of reinvigorating them with an arts responsibility? John Sloboda, what do you think of that?
I think that's a very good idea, and it's also, I think, very easily implementable, because if you go back to the community and participatory arts, councils already play a very important role in animating those, and it wouldn't be too difficult to, as it were, expand that role into what one might call the more traditional high arts sector, because the structures are in place already.
Ian, there's a question here that I think really is for you. It's from James Peaty, and he asks, do we need a new kind of ED levy for British film? This is a reference back to that legislation that you were talking about for film and British culture in general in this post-COVID world, maybe post-globalized world, James says.
We do. I mean, I said earlier that we
should explain what it was, the ED levy, for those people who don't know.
It was a wonderful idea that came out of Harold Wilson's National Film Finance Corporation. It followed the year after. It's named after the civil servant who invented it. Very simple idea. Most of the films shown in British cinemas are not British, they're American. If you take a small levy on the total box office and feed it into national production, you are using the box office, as it were, to fund local production, to support local production. It worked beautifully. It's still done in many countries. Margaret Thatcher abolished it in 1985. And when the ED levy went, the basis for actually funding new production in Britain by taking money from the box office for global studio production disappeared. And that was a tragedy. Yes, we do need an ED levy, of course. It's a brilliant idea. And it plays very well with what Marina was suggesting, that we have more sophisticated ways of taking small amounts of tax from all of the transactions that we do quite normally and feeding those into funding for the future of arts in Britain.
So that could be a very tiny levy that would build up into something very substantial.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Helen Jerome asks, people have been saying, who is our Marcus Rashford for culture? This may not actually be a bad idea, she says. Who could do the job for us? Well, this begs a question, doesn't it, about how effective the current advocates for arts and culture are. Perhaps we can leave that question to one side. But I'd really like you to all have a think about who might, maybe Marcus Rashford could be the Marcus Rashford for culture. If anybody can, discover, who his favourite filmmaker is, or who his favourite playwright is, perhaps he should be approached. Go on, name your candidates.
Let me say something about that, if I may. I do think, I hope this isn't going to get me into too personal waters, but we lack in, let's say, screen arts, let's call it cinema, in Britain. We do lack major spokespeople who are listened to. I mean, when I used to work at the BFI, and in my earlier years, there were figures like Richard Attenborough, who had a voice, a presence. And when Dickie spoke, people listened. He was a man of substance, a man of tremendous achievements behind him. People took him seriously. Subsequently, David Putnam has played a tremendous part in advocating for a British film industry and much else attached to it. We do really lack spokespeople who command, in my field, who command national attention and international attention. It's very sad, but it's a fact, and I think we need to grow some new ones.
There are
steal them.
They're like figures like Mary Beard and Grayson Perry, who've spoken out. It's a lot of actors, are very, very outspoken and good.
Yeah.
I agree. The Marcus Rashford charisma is very, very special.
Yeah.
So, and also he has youth on his side, which is something I think we probably should look for our.
Well, we have Steve McQueen.
Yes, Steve McQueen, exactly. He's an example.
Who I'm glad to say, long may he prosper and may he extend his reach. His exhibition at Tate Britain about year 3 school children was absolutely fantastic.
Well,
I've got suggestions coming in on the Q&A feed. If any of you want to add any more to this, this would be great. But Charlotte Crofts is suggesting Stormzy. And also points out that culture brings in more GDP than the whole of sport.
Yeah. In my field, I would opt for Benjamin Zephaniah, who's extraordinarily eloquent and wonderful in talking about poetry, talking to people, and so on. He's just the most amazing figure. And I would elect him as our spokesman.
We're almost coming to the end of our time here, but I just want to end, I think, by asking you all to think about what you want to preserve about this experience. We've talked about its difficulties and its frustrations. We've talked about despair. We've talked about some of the things that have been discovered during it. But if we can imagine ourselves forward to a year or 2 years' time, we know what we want to leave behind. But what is it that you would like to preserve from this experience? Isabel?
I think it's the rediscovery of interactive art. I think it's the ways in which many institutions, many individuals, many small groups have risen and found a way of producing this kind of dialogic relationship, whether it's in rap or whether it's in other contexts. And that's what I'd want to preserve.
John?
Very similar. It's communality, doing things together, that at the end of a cultural experience, there's a we that has experienced it together, shaped it together, contributed to its making. The we-ness of culture is completely central to me.
Marina Warner.
Well, I was thinking about how in isolation there were these wolf children, and when people were really well-meaning and they tried to teach them to speak, they couldn't speak. And I think what I would take is how much I missed that sort of coming that to and fro, that sharpens your wits, that opens your mind, that makes you discover things. As you hear someone, a friend, reflecting on something that that friend has done or you've done together. So it's the same as what the others are saying, but I just put it more in the area of expressivity and language.
Ian Christie, I think you may get the last word here. The iris closes on you. What do you want to retrieve and recuperate from this situation?
I mentioned Steve McQueen a moment ago, who seems to be one of the most exciting talents who's emerged out of being a gallery artist, becoming a major filmmaker. But of course, he has to turn to the big battalions, to the studios, to get his work made and widely seen. Think of another filmmaker who's a real talent that's emerged in Britain in recent years, Andrea Arnold, a wonderful film Fish Tank. Again, that sense that one has to go to America to make it. Let's be blunt about this. I would like to see a situation in which it's possible for these and future talents to actually work in Britain. And that, of course, is, if you like, rather nostalgically harking back to the days when there was support for the British film industry. I think it's really important. And I think that, I hope that we will get back to that situation. Why not?
We've come to the end of our time now. So I just want to thank all of our panelists who joined us this afternoon for their time thinking through, thrashing out the problems, the opportunities of this crisis. Shall we all meet up in a year's time and see how we're faring in the rubble or in the bright new buildings that are going to spring from that rubble? Thank you all very much indeed. Isabel Armstrong, Ian Christie, John Sloboda, and Dame Marina Warner. Thank you everybody for joining us. Good afternoon.
Bye-bye.